Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah. Do you see me?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So, こんばんは. Good evening for everyone. My name is Shinpei Ishii. I'm currently acting director of the Japan Foundation, Los Angeles. And thank you so much for choosing us today as well. This is the fourth and last lecture of the lecture series, Who's Who of Japanese Deities, by Michael van Hartingsveld. He is talking about Buddha tonight. It's the most important group of deities for Japanese Buddhism art. And so I have two housekeeping announcements. So first is please use Q&A function to raise a question. You can use it freely during the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, please join evaluation survey. That's gonna be really important for us to collect your opinion, comments, or any feedbacks in order to improve our future events. So please help us in the end, at the last of the lecture. So without further ado, I would like to invite Michael. So, Michael, お願いします。
Hello, I am so happy to be joining you for this, the last of the lectures. For those who don't know me, my name is Michael van Hartingsveld. I have been lecturing with the Japan Foundation, Los Angeles, for a couple of years now. I've done a variation of this lecture series about 2 years previously to this, but I've since learned a lot more since I first did it. So I'm sort of presenting information that's new to myself, and hopefully I'm able to better explain it for you to understand. There's a lot of information to get through, so I am going to jump in right now and start introducing, as Ishii-san described, I'm going to be talking about Buddhas. So the lecture series is called The Who's Who of Japanese Deities and How to Identify Them in Japanese Art. Basically, the goal of this series is to make sure that you all have the basic information you need to be able to identify these deities as you see them in temples or in museums. The hierarchy of deities, as Ishii-san also described, the Buddhas are at the top. We sort of went from the bottom and we moved up in this series of lectures. We started with the celestial beings, the Tenbu, then we moved up into the wisdom kings, the Myo-o, then we went to the Bodhisattvas, the Bosatsu, and then today we are discussing the Buddhas, or Nyorai. Now, when we describe anything in an iconographic fashion, when we're talking about how something looks, especially in Japanese art, you will always find an exception. I'll be giving you a lot of different rules or different imagery or iconography that are associated with these deities, but it's not a hard and fast rule. You are always going to find an exception to all these rules. So I just want you to bear that in mind, that as we go forward, as you go into a temple, as you go into a museum, realize that even though these things seem to be patterns, they're not always going to be fixed. So Butsu and Nyorai are sort of interchangeable. The meanings are different, but in this case, in what I'm describing here, they are largely going to be interchangeable here. Now, Buddhas, they are enlightened beings, meaning they have achieved enlightenment and they have exited from the cycle of rebirth. If we remember back to the Bodhisattvas lecture I gave, there's 6 different realms of rebirth. The Butsu and Nyorai, they are not subject to that anymore. Instead, they exist on the outside of this cycle. They are largely teachers. They are exemplars of Buddhist teaching. And you can identify them when you look at these Buddhas in their simple clothing. If we look at the clothing here in these sculptures, the seated being and the standing being, we see that they are wearing sort of like monk-like clothing. Simple robes, unadorned, and we compare that to the Bodhisattvas from last lecture, who were covered in jewelry, they had armbands, they had crowns on their head, they look very princely. But the Buddhas, the Nyorai, they are clothed usually in simple clothing. There's a lack of ornamentation, there's no jewelry around the neck, there's no armbands, there's no wristbands, there's no bracelets. Instead, what we have are something called the Sanju Niso, the 32 signs. And these are scripturally based ways that they're signs of an enlightened being, of a Buddha. There are some of these, they talk about the length of the teeth or the number of hairs distributed across the body or the length of the arms. But the ones that you are most likely to see and to be able to identify in Buddhist sculptures, especially in sculptures of Buddha, are the cranial protuberance, which we see at the top of the head here. You can see it looks like almost like a bump on top of the head. That is the cranial protuberance, or the Nikkei. Then if we look at the way that the hair is laid out, they look like snail shells, or they're really tightly bound. And these are called rahotsu. And the rahotsu, that is another identifying feature. It's one of the 32 signs. And then also there is the light emitting bump of hair, the byakugo. And if we look closely at these sculptures, you can barely see it on the standing one, but on the seated one, if you look just above the eyes, right about here, that is where the byakugo is. Now, a lot of people, they refer to it as a third eye, but I feel like that's a really sort of like new agey way of looking at it. Rather, it's just a light emitting bump of hair. That's the most easy way to describe that. Now, Buddhas, they do feature in something called a sanzon, or a triad. They usually, so a triad, as the name suggests, it consists of 3 different specific deities in a grouping. The central figure usually lends the name to the triad. So you've got an Amida triad, an Amida sanzon. You've got a Yakshi sanzon. You've got a Fudo sanzon. The deity that is in the center, the central deity, is the one that lends the name to the triad. And the one in the center is usually larger than the attendant figures to the left and right of there. I think this is a fairly extreme example. Usually you might even see some of the Bodhisattvas, they might be about 3/4 of the height, or even less of a difference between them. They are proportional, but I don't think you would ever see the Bodhisattvas larger than the Buddha. They're always going to be smaller, and that's how you can identify an attendant being. Now, one of the Nyorai, I think one of the most famous Nyorai, one of the most popular that you will see in temples, is Shakanyurai. Shakanyurai, he derives from Shakyamuni, who is the historical Buddha. I don't want to get too much into the story because it's fairly lengthy, and I'm sure a lot of you are somewhat familiar with the story of the historical Buddha, but he did enjoy a life of princely leisure, and then he became an ascetic after he realized that there was more than just the leisurely life of a prince. He practiced as an ascetic. He basically gave up all his physical wants and needs, and basically starved himself. He ended up descending from a mountain emaciated, and then as he meditated beneath a tree, he achieved enlightenment, and that's what changed him from becoming a being, sort of like a terrestrial being, a human being, into somebody that surpassed humanity and saw the truth of all things. The ways that you can identify Shakanyurai are here in the mudras, especially in the hand gestures. The mudra of fearlessness, the Semui In, is the right hand raised here. And it's making sort of, not cupping, but holding the hand up. as if making kind of like a stop. And then here, the lowered left hand is the mudra of wish granting, the yoganin. And it almost resembles the mudra of fearlessness, but it's lowered, the palm up rather than facing down, as with the Semui-in. Now, there is also a mudra of meditation, the Zenjo-in, that we see with Shaka, and we'll see that usually in seated images. And then if you see Bodhisattvas that are attending to Shakanyurai, they're usually attended by Fugen and Monju. If we remember to the last lecture, Fugen is usually seated on the back of an elephant, and Monju is usually seated on the back of a lion. So these are three variants of Shaka that you might see. The one on the far left is called Tanjo Butsu, or the Buddha at birth. And you can see these sort of childlike proportions. And as the Buddha is born, the story goes that he reached one hand up to the heavens and he pointed one hand down to the earth. And right as he was born, he was able to speak, and he says, "I alone am treasured between heaven and earth." And it's a statement that sort of exemplified what he came to teach the rest of his life. In the middle, we have a depiction of the Shusan Shaka, Shaka descending from the mountain. Now, you remember that I mentioned that he practiced asceticism at the top of a mountain, and that as he descended, he was emaciated. This painting here depicts that moment as Shaka is descending down from the mountain, where he allegedly lived on only a kernel of rice and a drop of water each day. He starved himself. He basically gave up all earthly needs. And this represents his descent from the mountain. And we can see at the top of his head there, the hair is starting to recede from the top of his head, preparing for the expansion, preparing for the cranial protuberance. Now, the meditating Shaka on the far right is a seated figure, and there we can see the Zenjo-in that I was describing earlier. The hands sort of folded over each other. There's an overlap of the right hand over the left hand. There is another painting or another imagery that is associated with the historical Buddha, and that is with his departure from the cycle of rebirth. Here we can see an image of a figure laying in the center, right here, surrounded by a whole bunch of other beings. We'll zoom in a little bit later. This is called a Neihan, or Shaka's entry into nirvana. Here's the close-up. We can see here is Shaka lying in peaceful repose, and this represents his passing. But he's not really dying, rather he's just moving from the terrestrial plane into an existence that exists beyond the cycle of rebirth. And you can see that he's surrounded here. He's mourned by disciples, he's mourned by deities, he's mourned by bodhisattvas, and even down here at the bottom, you can see that he's mourned by different animals. Elephant, lion, horse, ox, leopard, they're all represented here, tiger. Sculptural representations of the Neihan aren't as common in Japan. You will see them every once in a while, but they are not as common as paintings. But the iconography is the same, a Buddha laying down in peaceful repose. The next Buddha that I want to talk about is Yakshi Nyorai. Yakshi Nyorai is Baishaja Guru, the medicine Buddha. He's associated with healing, as you would sort of determine from the name Medicine Buddha. And he also shows the mudras of fearlessness and wish granting. They look very, very similar. If we didn't have this object right there, it would be very similar to what you would see in a Shaka. However, the presence of that medicine jar, the yakuko in his left hand there, in the yoganin, where he's forming the wish granting mudra, that medicine jar identifies him as Yakshi Nyorai. Now, Yakshi Nyorai, he is often attended by Nikko and Gakko, who is the radiant sun bodhisattva and the radiant moon bodhisattva. But we might be able to recognize him a lot easier by looking at the Juni Shinsho. Now, if you remember back to when I was discussing the Tenbu, the celestial beings, there are 12 celestial generals. represented by the dragon, the ox, the boar, the rat, the zodiac animals. You can see them in the crowns there. And these all attend to Yakshi Nyorai, and they are also extensions of Yakshi Nyorai, and they help him fulfill his purpose. So if you see the Juni Shinsho wrapped around the base or surrounding a Buddha, it is most likely going to be Yakshi. Another Buddha that we're going to discuss is Dainichi Nyorai. Dainichi Nyorai is Mahavairochana. I call him the primordial Buddha. I've seen other terms associated with him as well, but the primordial, I think, captures the fact that he is the center, the origin of most things. And from him, many other deities and many other sentient beings emanate and manifest. Dainichi Nyorai is especially important in the Shingon and Tendai traditions. These are the esoteric traditions of Buddhism in Japan. He often forms something that's called the mudra of Dharma realm meditation. It looks very similar to Shaka's Zenjoin, but it's different in that the deity that forms it, there's a lot more represented there. We might more easily be able to identify Dainichi Nyorai by looking at his head, his headdress, what he wears on his head. He wears something called the jeweled crown, the hokan. And the hokan is something you wouldn't see on other Buddhas, but it is representative on a Dainichi Nyorai. He also forms the mudra of the knowledge fist, the chiken-in. And you can see that he forms that by taking a finger from the left hand and grasping it in the hand, in his right hand. He's holding it in such a way, and he's forming the mudra of the knowledge fist, the chiken-in. That is one way to identify Dainichi Nyorai. You might also see him in paintings, and he's often at the center of a whole bunch of other deities. Here he's situated at the center of the two-realm mandala, the Ryokai mandala. Here on the left we have the diamond realm, the Kongokai. And the Kongokai represents the universal Buddha fields. Basically that means the different Buddha areas that exist across the Buddhist universe. On the right-hand side here, we see the womb realm, the Taizokai. And the Taizokai, it represents the physical body aspects. So essentially how Dainichi manifests and emanates new forms from himself in an ever-expanding circle. If we can zoom in, we see that in the diamond realm, that Dainichi is forming the chiken-in, the knowledge fist. And in the Taizokai, in the womb realm, he is actually forming the Hokai Join. Now, Amida Nyorai is arguably the most popular of the Buddhas. He derives from Amitabha. He is the Lord of the Western Paradise of Ultimate Bliss, Saiho Gokuraku. He represents salvation for all. Now, in a culture that started with a lot of aristocrat, where salvation was only accessible by aristocrats who could afford monks to perform meritorious acts on their behalf. When we come into the Pure Land Buddhism, it represents this idea that Amida, as long as you show earnest faith in Amida Nyorai and you, in complete earnestness, chant out the Namu Amida Butsu, the Nenbutsu, we call that. If you say that in complete earnest, then Amida will whisk you away to his Western paradise, where you can continue living out your days with him. Amida is often attended to by Kanon Seishi and sometimes Jizo. And Amida, he forms something called the mudra of welcoming, the Raigo-in. On first glance, they look very similar to the Semui-in and the Yogan-in that Shaka forms. But if we look closer, we will see that the fingers are forming rings. And that can be either the index fingers, the middle fingers, the ring fingers. They can do any sort of combination of those. He also forms something called the mudra of meditation, but it's an Amida type with fingers bent. So before we saw the meditation, the join with the hands overlapping, with the Amida type, you see these fingers bent. Now, I have tried to do that myself. It is very difficult to get these to straighten out and to behave properly. So the Amida join, it takes a lot of practice to be able to do that correctly. But here we see the Amida join right there. Now, there are some visual stories told with Amida. One is that it's the welcoming descent of Amida, that he comes down to earth to welcome the recently deceased into the Western paradise and to bring them away. Here we can see 3 different images of Doraigo as it was developed in Japan. The one on the far left is Amida alone. He comes down. The one in the middle is the Amida triad, where he is accompanied by Seishi and by Kanon, who is carrying a throne, a lotus pedestal for the recently deceased soul. And the recently deceased soul will leap onto that lotus pedestal and be whisked away with Amida, with Kanon, with Seishi to the Western paradise. And then on the far right, we have Amida and 25 Bodhisattvas. And Amida and the 20 Bodhisattvas is just a large retinue. Some of them are playing instruments, and here we see Kanon on the bottom right, as with in the middle, offering a pedestal to the recently deceased. Now, there is a big head of hair sometimes associated with Amida, and this is called the 5 Aeons Amida. Now, Hozo, there are different ways to describe Hozo. I've heard him called a prince, I've heard him called a king, I've heard him called a monk, but I think the important detail is that Hozo was a being who was an aspiring bodhisattva. He was following the bodhisattva path, and he intensely meditated for 5 aeons, a gokoshi, and he left his hair untouched. Now, as he intensely meditated, he focused on 48 vows, and through these 48 vows was the creation of the Western paradise. Now, upon successfully realizing all of these vows to become reality, he achieved Buddhahood and then became Lord over that Western paradise that he had created. Now, you can identify a 5 Aeons Amida by looking at that large head of hair. And here he is forming the Gasho mudra, the Gashoin, the mudra of respect. The final Nyorai, the final Buddha that we are talking about in today's session is Maitreya, Miroku, who is the Buddha of the future. Now, Miroku currently, if we remember from last lecture, is a bodhisattva who is ministering to beings up in heaven, up in the Tusita heaven. However, he will appear as a Buddha after the age of decline. Now, the age of decline, Mappo, is this idea that the Buddhist teachings become irrelevant or ignored. And after, some scholars have determined that after around 6 billion years, that Miroku will come down to the earth and he will usher in the next age of Buddhist enlightenment. He often forms the mudra of exposition, or seppo-in. He is very difficult to identify by appearance alone, so you need to pay attention to context. He may be in something called the Miroku-do, a building dedicated specifically to Miroku, or he may appear in temples that are built around a hopeful look forward to the future. Now, this has been a blitz in iconography, so we are going to do a quick quiz. Just a note, you may have to move the poll on your screen so you can see the images. So I am going to set that poll now. I will bring the images up, and I will launch the polling for the quiz. So looking at number 1 on the far left, look at the hands. The hands are forming rings with the fingers. They're forming rings with the fingers. Now think very hard about the Buddha that we talked about. Some of them are forming figures like this, but others are using the rings in the fingers. Now think about which Buddha uses the ring, joining the finger and the thumb. In the middle one, let's not so much look at the mudras that are being formed, but rather at the thing that is being carried in their hand. Looking at the left hand, we can see that something is being carried in that. Think about which Buddha is associated with a jar in the left hand. And number 3 on the far right, we can see the same as what number 1 is doing, but the hands are not touching. One is being held up and the other is being held out. There's no object being held in the left hand. The fingers are not connected. So think about those mudras in association with identifying these beings. So number 1 on the far left, thinking about the fingers joined. In number 2, thinking about the jar in the left hand. And for number 3, looking at the hand gestures and the sort of the lack of a container in there as well. Now I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the quiz there, and we will look at the different selections. Look at the different answers. So number 1 was Amida. And the reason that we know it's Amida is because he's forming the Raigo-in. The Raigo-in is represented by the fingers touching each other on each hand. Number 2 was Yakshi. Yakshi is holding a medicine jar in his left hand. He forms the mudra of fearlessness and he forms the mudra of gift giving or wish fulfilling, wish granting. But he holds in his left hand a medicine jar. And on the far right, it's the same mudras as Yakshi, but there is no medicine jar there. Instead, Shaka, you see, is making the fearless mudra of fearlessness and the mudra of wish granting. Now, the sites where you can see these different figures, Shakanyurai, you can see at Seiryoji in Kyoto. Tanjo Buddha, you can see at Todaiji in Nara. The Neihan paintings, you can see a very famous one at Kongobuji on Mount Koya. Yakshi Nyorai, you can see at Shin-Yakshiji. The temple is named after him. Dainichi Nyorai, there's a very famous image at Toji in Kyoto. The Ryokai Mandara, you can see at Jingoji. The Amida Nyorai, you can see at Joruriji in Kyoto. The Amida Raigo, you can see at Kongobuji. There's a very famous example there. And then there's a 3-dimensional version of the Amida Raigo at the Byodo-in in Uji. Miroku Nyorai, you can see a very famous image at Kofukuji in Nara. Now, I do want to review with you some of the ways that we can identify the different beings. The Butsu or Nyorai has simple clothing, lack of ornamentation, a cranial protuberance on the top of the head, snail shell curls of hair, and a light-emitting bump of hair in the middle of the forehead. A bosatsu, a bodhisattva, you can identify by princely garb, wearing lots of jewelry and ornamental bands, carrying implements or forming mudras connected to their virtue or their purpose, and they often act as attendant deities. There are exceptions like Kanon or Jizo who are depicted individually, but quite often a bosatsu is going to be an attendant deity. The myo are often multi-armed, they're multi-faced. They carry implements and weapons, and they also form mudras that are connected to their purpose. And they often have a large flame mandorla that covers their entire back. Whereas the tenbu, the celestial being, is either a wrathful or peaceful. They are mostly two-armed and single-faced. And they have implements or weapons that are connected to their purpose as well. Many of them wear armor or aristocratic clothing. Now I'm going to turn it over for some questions. So one of the questions, Sam Coleman makes a very, very good point. One story has it that the curled hair on the Buddha's head represents snails who gathered there, protected him from the sun as he meditated. Have you ever heard that? Yes, that's a story that I've actually heard quite a bit associated with the Rahotsu, the snail curls. Amanda asks, is the medicine jar aimed for specific illness or just healing in general? Now, it's just healing in general. There are stories of many different historical emperors and princes and regents approaching Yakshi and asking him for healing either for themselves, or they will petition Yakshi on behalf of somebody that they love. Perry asks, while it's interesting to know where in Japan I can see these Buddhas, are there places here in Los Angeles where I can see them? Yeah, there are a few places in Little Tokyo. If you walk around that area, you can walk into some of the temples there and see these Buddhas. You can also go to the LACMA has got a fairly large collection of Buddhist art. You can see a lot of that on their website. And then Harry, final question. He's asking, Bosatsu are reaching for enlightenment while Nyorai have achieved it. I feel like that the Bosatsu have also achieved enlightenment, but they have very compassionately or graciously delayed their exit into what's beyond the cycle of rebirth. And they are basically ministering to sentient beings who are still going through the cycles of rebirth. Their goal is to make sure that all sentient beings are able to exit from the cycle of rebirth before they themselves become Buddhas. Does that make sense to everybody? Well, I think that is about all the time we have. This concludes the Who's Who of Japanese Deities lecture series. A quiz has been uploaded to the lecture page. I put together a quiz where you are able to choose different groupings of deities and test your knowledge against images. I will slowly be revisiting this quiz and uploading explanations for incorrect and correct answers, just so we can better understand the iconography. This is something that's going to be available starting tomorrow. I'm really grateful that you have all joined me for this entire series. It's been a lot of fun explaining the different deities to you. This is something I will sorely miss. And I really hope you've learned a lot and have been able to take this information, and I hope you will be able to use it in the future to help you identify other deities in temples or in museums. So thank you so much for joining us, and please stay tuned for more programming from the Japan Foundation Los Angeles. Please take a moment to complete the digital lecture questionnaire via the poll function. If you would like to comment on today's programming, you may do so during the Q&A function. If you have any further questions or comments, if there are any further explanations you need, please direct those to michaelvanhardingsveld@gmail.com. I would be very, very happy to answer any questions you might have. Again, I feel very privileged. I feel very lucky to have been able to be involved with this, and I'm very grateful that you have decided to join us today. Thank you so much.
All right. So one more again, I would like to thank you for everyone who joined tonight and the past lectures series. Since as I see, we had over 100 participants tonight, and I thought this was a really good sign for us organizer that literally nobody dropped out during the session. So yeah, this was a really good sign. And through the past 4 lectures, we have been getting really good positive feedback from you guys. And then many of you demanded more deeper, further lectures in the different aspects of the Japanese arts. So we are currently planning and thinking how we bring another lecture series for you. So although Michael is he should be really busy with his graduate school, but I hope we will come back to you with another different lecture series. to you soon or for a while after. And please, please join the questionnaire. And actually, we will include all of you to our email news list. So we will soon follow up. We will send the follow-up email with a link to the today's recorded video and some more follow-up information. So please stay tuned and stay safe until we see each other again. So, good night. おやすみなさい。ありがとうございました。